Welcome to the Crux of Cardio. I'm Jordan Burgin, Head of Cardiovascular at Crux. In 2024, I very nearly suffered a cardiac arrest due to an underlying illness. It was unexpected and it fundamentally changed how I look at the industry. Since joining Crux, my role has been simple but ambitious in practice: to strengthen the cardiovascular ecosystem by supporting the people building it through talent, through fundraising and through community. Helping founders, executive clinicians and investors connect in ways that genuinely move the needle. We started the Crux of Cardio to spotlight the incredible work happening across the cardiovascular space, the technologies, the teams, the setbacks and the breakthroughs, and most importantly, the very real patient impact behind it all. I hope you enjoy this episode. My name is Jordan Burgin and this is another episode of the Crux of Cardio, and we are today joined by Carine from Cardiawave. Carine, I'll let you give yourself a brief introduction quickly.
Thank you very much and good morning, Jordan. Thanks a lot for hosting me. That's an honor. I'm leading Cardiawave since June last year. I know Cardiawave for much longer. I've been a member of the board of directors since summer 2024, and I've been monitoring the company since 2023. Reason is that I've been spending most of my professional life in the medical device space, large companies and smaller ones, but essentially in the cardiovascular space and even more in what we call now, since around 20 years, the structural heart space, meaning heart valve disease. And so I kind of place a lot of interest in anything that will disrupt the way we treat patients suffering from heart valve disease, and that's what led me to notice Cardiawave. I said my background is essentially medical device, but also with a passion for breakthrough innovations. I've had the luck, the privilege to contribute to several massive changes that led to better standard of care for the treatment of different diseases. From when I was at J&J at the very beginning of my career, those were the days where we were transforming laparotomy to laparoscopy, so allowing patients to benefit from way less invasive procedure. And in the same way, I was at Medtronic when the first transcatheter valve was launched, Melody, which again was allowing children or grown-up patients suffering from congenital pulmonary valve disease to benefit from a way less invasive procedure than a surgical replacement. And so Cardiawave is setting up the next frontier in the treatment of heart valve diseases, in the fact that what we're developing is a totally non-invasive procedure. So if you want today for heart valve disease, you have surgical way to treat, and which is a full replacement, or a transcatheter approach, which is less invasive, where you expand a valve in the native valve, but it still requires to get into the body of the patient. And then what Valvosoft is now proposing for patients that are too frail for any of this treatment is a totally non-invasive way. So there is no need to enter anything in the body of the patient. So that's me in a nutshell, and the reason why I have decided to join Cardiawave.
Quite the introduction, and it's funny. The recent guests that we've had have actually had bits of different backgrounds. We've had people that have came from tech. We had someone that came from finance actually as well, which helps with the fundraising side. You've got quite the heavy metal background in medtech. How long have you been in medical devices for, Carine?
Well, since my very first job, that means since 1992, very first job was at J&J, and back then it was the entry-level job. I was we were called sales rep, but actually our job was to be days in, days out in the OR with the surgeons to train them on how to move from opening the abdomen or the thorax and look at the organs and replace them, to no longer do that, do a few very small incision, plant what we call trocars that would allow them to enter the instruments and then operate in 2D looking at the screen. If you think about a massive change for the physician, this is the one for sure. And our role was to number one, allow them to train themselves, so bringing them to the J&J facilities, the different labs we had in Germany, Hamburg, or in Paris, and train them there, and then be back with them in their OR and be with them, just allowing them to refer to a person from the company on how to use the instruments. So that has been really fascinating. And from there on, I knew my life was going to be in this space. And even more so, I kept on looking for opportunities to participate to breakthrough innovations. And that would, on the one hand, probably be disruptive for the physicians, which I acknowledge, but also embarking them into something that is better for the patients, and at the end, even better for the system, because if you think about laparoscopy or transcatheter valve, this has a huge impact, health economic impact on the system. It's reducing complications, it's reducing length of stay, it's reducing cost of care overall. So that's also a dimension that I always kept on my radar. Innovations have to be meaningful from both perspectives.
Amazing.
Better for the patients as well as better for the system, so that we can absorb them and deliver it to the biggest number of
That
patients.
makes sense. So was there a specific moment when you realized Cardiowave's approach to treating aortic stenosis could genuinely change patient care? What was it that stood out for you?
So, the whole vision of the founders and inventors was to, again, treat two patient populations that they had identified that could not benefit of the current standard of care, which means a valve replacement, an aortic valve replacement. Yes, I should emphasize that the focus at the moment is on aortic valve disease. And so there were two categories of patients, one that they believe was, and that they could see in the hospital, because one of the founders is a cardiologist in a very large hospital in Paris called Hôpital Européen Georges Pompidou, which has a very long history of innovation in heart valve disease with Professor Alain Carpentier, who worked there most of his career. So they have a long legacy of dealing with heart valve disease. So Professor Emmanuel Messas, who is a cardiologist at Hôpital Européen Georges Pompidou, observed that patients that were referred to the heart team at his hospital at times would be considered non-eligible for the heart valve replacement, whether a surgical or even a transcatheter valve, because they were considered too frail, too sick. And he felt that these patients needed help, needed support, because they were still suffering from symptoms of heart failure. And he thought that he could use ultrasounds to treat this population, because this is totally non-invasive. So that was the first patient population he had in mind. But then also he saw that there were patients referred to the heart team that were at the beginning of the disease, and the heart team are not allowed to replace a valve if you're at what we call the moderate, the early stage of the disease. You're not sick enough, and the risk benefit of the procedure are not positive, because even with a transcatheter valve, it's still a risky procedure: stroke rates, dissection, bleeding, pacemaker post-procedure. So with that in mind, he went to three physicists, friends of his, and they developed the Valvosoft non-invasive ultrasound therapy to treat these two populations. So at that time, that was in 2014, they were not yet on my radar. But as I was looking at different technologies emerging at the human stage, Cardiawave appeared on my radar. And it's back then I say, interesting. I see the vision, I see the need. The clinical need is there for sure. Some patients are too frail for the current standard of care. Some patients are not sick enough, and still it would be good to do something to alleviate, or to reduce the progression of the disease. And so I started to watch. Back then, they were in the early days of first in human studies. Actually, they had started the pivotal for CE mark, and the early data were promising. The first thing I was looking at was safety. I was a bit concerned. If you go on and send ultrasound on calcification on an aortic valve, the first thing that comes to mind is stroke rates. So I was keen to have access to their data on the level of stroke rates during the procedures and within the 30 days post-procedures. And when I saw the first set of data, stroke rate was 0%, which at first sounded not even real, but has been confirmed. And fast forward today, 100 patients have been treated, but 125 procedures have been completed because some patients could benefit from a retreatment. And we're still at 0% stroke rate. So from a safety point of view, that was the number one concern. Number two, is this going to create conduction issues? You send ultrasound. Yes, the aim is to be very, very focused, but you never know. You may touch adjacent structure and create conduction issues. Again, 0% of pacemaker implantation post-procedure, no report of major conduction issues during and post-procedure. So that was the second thing. Third, you always look within such an innovation at per procedure, during the procedure, mortality. And again, that was 0%. So based on that, I was really, I think, convinced that they had something into their hands. Absolutely. Now, it's one thing to be safe, but you also have to be efficacious. So when you look at the data and today, and I looked at the data back then, and to your point, I was very reassured that the technology was, and the procedure was feasible, technology is safe, but what about efficacy? The value proposition for these very frail patients that were treated in the first place is, can we alleviate your symptoms? And so there were hemodynamic improvement that are also linked to quality of life improvement. And this is what has been observed at 12-month follow-up with the good improvement on the hemodynamic side, meaning the valve reopens more, which translates into a better amount of volume of blood flow going through the valve during the systole-diastole cycles. And this translated into patients reporting that they were feeling better. We used two ways to evaluate that. One is called KCCQ, which is a scoring system which is quite used in heart failure studies. And there is definitely a big improvement, 9 points at 12 months. And we also look at the evolution of the New York Heart Class, where we saw that the patients went down in New York Heart Class, right? The New York Heart Class were from 1 to 4, 4 being you're really in a bad condition, 1 you're okay. And so the idea is to lower the classes, which you could also observe. So again, long answer to your question, but when I saw all of that, I was absolutely convinced that there was something meaningful, a well-identified patient population, technology that is truly non-invasive, and we can further elaborate on that. What is the mechanism of action? Because I think that this is something that needs to be explained and understood by your audience. But yeah.
Before we move on to that, something I wanted to understand, and so like when developing a first of its kind non-invasive therapy like this, what are the biggest trade-offs that you have to make between safety and efficacy, if there was any trade-offs to be made?
Yes, that's a good question. And I think that at the beginning, there were some maybe missed communication, because the trade-off is that you're going to be less invasive and you're going to treat patients that, again, are not eligible for the current standard of care. When you replace a valve, you fully reopen the valve. So you restore the full effective orifice area of the valve. So you're low, really, you kind of aim to go back to what nature had designed. I mean, a bit lower, because when you replace a valve, you may not be able to get the exact same diameter as the original valve, but still. So that's clear. Again, when we look at the non-invasive approach, it was for patients that are either too frail and you really don't want to touch this patient, even if it's a minimally invasive procedure like a transcatheter valve replacement, because just as you can imagine, just making an incision in the femoral arteries of those patients, those arteries are very calcified. So then you already have a risk of dissection of the main vessel. Then you push up a tube, which is, yes, small diameter, flexible, but still you're pushing it against throughout the aorta, against the aortic wall. And in these patients, you have a high likelihood to have calcification at that level there. So you're also creating a risk of strokes. The tissues are fragile, you may create bleeding, etc., etc. So really, this population was clearly identified. Nothing could be done. So when you go less invasive, the trade-off will be, we're not going to reopen the valve in full like if you were to replace the valve. But definitely the aim was to reduce the impact of the heart failure symptoms, which is what has been demonstrated. When you think about the other patient population, it's the same thing. You're referred with a moderate aortic stenosis. Actually, it might have been, and most of the time that's the case, it's diagnosed incidentally. You go to your physician for a cold, and through the stethoscope, they may identify what's called the murmur. It's a very recognizable sound that the aortic valve makes when it's becoming narrower. As the moment it starts to be calcified, there will be this very recognizable noise. So you will be referred to an echocardiographist. You didn't know you had anything, no symptoms. You're referred to an echocardiographist, and they will measure the size, the surface of your valve, and they'll tell you you're suffering from moderate aortic valve stenosis. Your question will be, so what do we do? And the answer will be nothing at the moment. We're going to monitor you every year until the moment you get to a stage where you're severe, you'll probably be symptomatic, and then we will replace your valve. And the reason why this is that way, it's because, again, the risk to the valve replacement. So they don't want to put a patient that is not suffering from the disease into a situation where the patient may take a risk to treat something that is not yet impacting his quality of life, her quality of life. So where we're thinking about non-invasive, we're going to offer this treatment to populations that are not suffering, that are at the onset of the disease, with a different value proposition than for the frail patient. It's not to alleviate your symptoms because you don't have symptoms, but it is to minimize or slow down the progression of the disease. At the moment, the only other technologies that are, or not technologies, the only other treatments that are available for this type of patients are drugs that are also in clinical studies at the moment. There is nothing that is market approved. And we think that we're going to position ourselves like drugs because we're totally non-invasive, but even better because we have no side effect. This is what has been demonstrated in our studies. And we're going to show that we can slow down the progression of the disease. That's a protocol that we're putting together. But again, we're not claiming that we replace the valve on this population. Well, at that point in time, anyway, there is no need to replace the valve. Now, to be fully complete into this explanation, at the moment, there's 2 studies going on with transcatheter valves for patients that are at the moderate stage of the disease, but they're moderate and moderate. You can be early moderate and you're not symptomatic and your left ventricular function is not yet impacted. You're still quite healthy. And then there's end stage moderate. We're close to severe, and there you're already sorry for that. You're already symptomatic. You're suffering from your disease, and those studies aim to show that a valve replacement could be the right answer at that stage, which I fully agree. And again, I don't see any overlap between where we want to position Valvosoft at the early stage of the disease and the transcatheter valve for moderate patients that are at end stage moderate, already suffering from their disease. So yeah, those are the trade-offs. Now, from a safety point of view, we're safer when you look at stroke rates, dissection, bleeding, pacemaker implantation post-procedure. Our data are definitely better than the ones of a transcatheter valve. But that's where the trade-off is. More invasive, potentially more complication, but higher efficacy for those patients that require a valve replacement. With a non-invasive procedure or drugs, we're going to be non-invasive, we're going to be safer, there will be less complication, and the impact in terms of efficacy is going to be different, going to be lower, but again, we're not willing to be considered like a valve replacement. So I hope this makes sense. I think very important that I could clarify that, and thank you for the opportunity, because I think we had some misunderstanding at the very beginning of the experiment of Valvosoft.
And with your sort of few personal human data, what surprised you most? It doesn't have to be positively, it could be negatively, unexpectedly, but what do you think has most stood out to you from your early feasibility studies?
So at first, evidently, you always look at safety, right? That's the primary endpoint of any first-in-human, and even in a early pre-market pivotal study, focus on safety is essential. So we were very happy, not really surprised, because the hypothesis was that stroke rate was going to be very low, and gave an explanation on why that is. But it was really great to get the confirmation of the fact that the hypothesis was valid, because I didn't really say something about the mechanism of action, and maybe I should at this stage, and then I can go back to your question on the positive or the surprises on the clinical data. But the way Valvosoft works is it is sending high intensity focused ultrasound on the calcification on the leaflets, on the aortic valve leaflets, right? So it's image guided. So you have an echo, you have a transducer that's showing to the physicians where the calcifications are, and then they can be guided, they can be directing the high intensity focused ultrasound on those specific areas that have been identified. So when you send the high intensity focused ultrasound, they will go through the soft tissue of the leaflets. So the leaflets is made of soft tissue, and within those leaflets, so consider the leaflets like a bag, and within the leaflets, within the tissues of their calcifications that are entrapped, that are growing. So when the high intensity focused ultrasound will touch a calcification, then it will create a cavitation bubble. Those cavitation bubble will immediately implode within milliseconds. They will create a shock wave that will fragment the calcification. But the pouch, the integrity of the leaflets, the soft tissue remains untouched. We do not injure the soft tissue, which means that you have, how would I say that? The calcification remain within the leaflets. You just change the structure, if you see what I mean. It's like we take an analogy at times of a chocolate plate. You have an aluminum wrap and you have a solid plate of chocolate in it. If we were to send ultrasound, we would fragment it, but we would not endanger the aluminum wrapping. So at the end, you just change the structure of what's in the bag, what's in the pouch, what's in the aluminum wrapping. That's the exact same principle that that allowed the physician to think about this approach, right? Because they knew from histopathological analysis that when you explant the valve, you see that the tissues, the calcifications are entrapped within the leaflet. Now, some people ask us then, but why is it that when you expand a transcatheter valve, you can create a stroke rate? And one of the hypotheses might be that when you deploy a valve, you will it's a bit of a more aggressive moment, if I may say it that way, and the leaflets of the native valves are entrapped, are caged between the aortic wall and the stent of the bioprosthesis, the transcatheter valve, and you may injure then the soft tissue, and you may have some embolization because of the injury created to the tissue. But in our case, we also did brain MRI pre and post to check if there was no, besides the fact we did not observe any stroke, if there was any silent stroke, and the images were very clean. There was nothing to be concerned about. So I hope that the mechanism of action is clarified, because it's very important. It's a question we get quite often. But how come? And we did extensive work in a preclinical setup. That was in animal models, more than 50, and on the histological analysis of those valves that we explanted post procedure, we could really show that there was no injury to the soft tissue. So that's that. Then I guess the other good surprises was also that we could be very targeted. And if we were not, we would have seen way more conduction issues. And so that means that the hypothesis, which is that we can really go on to what we call the focal point, which, on average will have the size of a grain of rice. That's, as precise as we can be. And that means we didn't touch the adjacent structure on the left ventricular septal wall, which has a passage for a bundle of His, which is a very important electrical element of the heart. So if you disturb or if you injure tissue at that level, you may create major conduction issue. So again, we didn't observe that. So that was also a very good surprise. For the rest, right, we didn't had any concern about potential dissections or bleedings, etc., because we didn't enter into the body, didn't insert anything into the body of the patient. So then, what's also really nice to observe is that the hemodynamic results are maintained at 12 months. So that's the follow-up we had in the pivotal study, which is really nice. Other device that can be used, because Valvosoft will also be used to prepare the valve before a transcatheter deployment. So that's one of the possible indication we have in Europe, because the CE mark is for patients that are not eligible for an immediate TAVR. So if the physicians decide that they cannot deploy a valve in the current anatomy of the patients because of really huge block of calcification, they may decide to use Valvosoft, conduct a procedure, let's say 30 days before the valve deployment, and then soften the leaflet, change the structure of the calcification, which would allow them to further down the road better deploy the valve. And so this, I think, is also something that is very important. And so to the comparison, at the moment, they may use a balloon, aortic valvuloplasty, BAV. And when you look at, number one, the safety profile, balloon aortic valvuloplasty have some risk, strokes, dissections, etc. But also the results are not maintained. Post 6 months, the AVA, the effective orifice area, the aortic valve area, are back to where it was before. So that was also a good surprise to see that at 12 months, the benefit in terms of reopening of the valves are maintained. That was, I think, the nice surprise. And yeah, when we looked at the correlation between the hemodynamic benefit and the patients reporting better quality of life, that was the ultimate quest for this technology. And I think that overall, yes, excellent results at this stage on a frail population. We're very excited now to restart the procedures post CE mark in Europe. We're finalizing all the paperwork, translations, labeling, and everything that needs to be done once you get CE mark. And as of beginning of March, we will redeploy Valvosoft robots in France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And we will initiate what we call a PMCF post-market clinical follow-up, allowing us to continue to collect clinical data and continue to learn on the potential of the procedures.
I'm interrupting this episode to bring you a word from our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical technology development with deep scientific and engineering expertise. They support ambitious medtech companies in solving high-risk, high-complexity challenges where there's no margin for error. Whether you're tackling uncharted technical territory or racing to bring a product to market, TTP provide clarity and direction. By de-risking innovation and ensuring seamless alignment with regulatory and manufacturing demands, TTP help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
There's some incredible results there, and I think even the way it's used, you mentioned there being like a combination, using it before going into a TAVR procedure, it is incredible. How have the physicians found it? Like, what was their reaction to the idea of treating aortic stenosis in a non-invasive fashion?
So I would say that at the beginning, they were reservation, and it's it's thanks to the fact that, physicians remain first and foremost driven by what's good for their patients, and they're scientists as well. So we had a very nice group of cardiologists, interventional cardiologists, and echocardiologists who decided to participate to the study because they wanted to see by themselves. I could at some stage, put you in contact with one of the head of department in a very large site in France who was saying, I was skeptical at the beginning. I wanted to see by myself. And today, if it was me, my aortic valve, my stenosis, I would give it a try first with a non-invasive approach to delay the moment my valve, my natural valve, native valve is going to be replaced. So that was, I think, one of the best testimonial I heard from someone who has 40 years of experience in interventional cardiology, has seen a lot, has tested a lot, was skeptical, but because of his willingness to be a good scientist and because of his willingness to offer something to patients that had no other source of hope, he became one of the strongest believers. And he's not the only one. We conducted our first in human and pivotal studies in 12 leading European sites. And in all those sites, I think we've reached a very positive outcome and then very positive feedback from the users. Just one site joined the study late, only did one patient, which was probably not enough for them to get a good idea. But what was interesting is that when the study was completed, so we had to pull out the Valvosoft from that site. And we got a call saying, you need to bring it back because since we have shared with the referral physicians that Valvosoft is available in our sites, we get patients that we thought we would never be seeing before, right? It's very interesting also the pull effect that Valvosoft have created in the sites that were participating to the study, meaning that by now, the GPs, the city cardiologists do know who are the patients that will be accepted for transcatheter valve replacement and those that are not going to be accepted too far. So they do not refer the patients, right? Why would you send a patient to a heart team if you know that the answer will be no? So when Valvosoft was made available in those centers, they communicated to the referral physicians and the referral network, and they started to see patients that were actually very frail and that were candidates for Valvosoft. And what was also interesting, and I have a parallel on that, is that they got more and more patients, and some of these patients actually were candidates for TAVR. So they contacted the referring physician, say, hey, look, I know you refer this patient for a non-invasive, but we think we can do something with a TAVR. So is that okay? And the patient would then benefit from something where in the past he would not even have been referred, because it's not that the city cardiologists or the referring physicians are blocking, but they don't want to create false hope for their patients. So when transcatheter valves arrived on the market in 2007, 2008, it was interesting to see that it had the same pull effect. So more patients were referred to hospitals, and then more patients were referred to cardiac surgery, actually. So it was creating a whole higher, larger volume of cases. So that's what we think will happen as well. And when we talk to physicians, they really see Valvosoft as an additional tool in the toolbox to treat aortic valve stenosis at the onset of the disease as well as at the very end of the disease. And the heart team will make a decision. You can also, as you just said, combine. So you may say, okay, we're going to use a Valvosoft to prep the valve and then deploy a TAVR. We may use a Valvosoft to stabilize the patient. We have read some patients that at the beginning were considered not eligible for TAVR, got a Valvosoft, got better, and then, because they were less frail, became candidate for a TAVR and got a TAVR. So I think that you can look at all sorts of combinations. At the onset of the disease, what the cardiologists are telling us is that the end in mind would be a combination of drug and Valvosoft. The drug will treat the root cause of the disease, at the the lipoprotein A issue, that's the drug effect. And Valvosoft will treat the calcifications or the fibrotic tissues that are already created. So, it's going to be, I like the idea of this toolbox where you have your drugs, your non-invasive, your more invasive, like surgical procedures. Still, a lot of patients get their valve replaced through a surgical approach. Some of them because they need a mechanical valve because they're very young and there is no good reason to implant a biological prosthesis. Some, they're a bit older, they may get a biological prosthesis, but not in a transcatheter. So you see, when you talk about lifetime management of the disease, we innovators, we need to add tools to the toolbox of the cardiologist. And it's not about replacing, it's really about combining more of those tools to ensure that the patients will benefit throughout the progression of the disease of the best treatment at a certain point in time. And it's also, I think, very important that we look at the total cost of these patients. So with non-invasive approach, you replace valve with you may not replace the valve, but you will delay the progression of the disease, which is good because you don't want to replace a valve too early. If you do that too early, the likelihood that you will need to replace the replacement and then replace the replacement gets higher, and that's not a good thing for the healthcare system, nor for the patients. So
It's good, like you said, there's a fine line, isn't there? I think this is the future of medtech. You see it with other spaces, the bariatric space, for example, GLP-1s, using medication, then using balloons before going in for gastric procedures, etc., or combining them for a total efficacy program. So I do think it is the absolute future of this space, which is brilliant. One thing I wanted to zoom out on just before we move on to a different segment, really, is you kind of brushed over it, but it is quite the feat. How did you find navigating regulatory strategy under EU MDR? I know that a lot of companies have been finding this quite the headache in Europe, so it'd be good to see how you guys found it.
yes. So well, first and foremost, we take a lot of pride from the fact that we could obtain CE mark under MDR. It's a sign of credibility. Remember, back then, CE was considered not robust enough, and that's why they pivoted to the whole other side of the scale, meaning that now it's overly complicated. Number one, it's a process that doesn't have clearly identified milestone. Number two, so that's, I think, what's creating the headache. But we I think that the reason why for us it came earlier than what we had anticipated. I thought it would be around March this year, based on the process that we had been through. The technical file was very robust. So when you submit a technical file in the MDR, there is always, most of the time they come back after 1 month or 2 or 3 saying your file is incomplete. We miss this and this and that. And so you're back to point zero and you submit, and it's not that you have progress in the process, you're back to square one. In our case, it took them a while, but we got an answer, technical file complete, we're happy with everything we have, which was, I think, a big sign of credibility of what the team had done here, the R&D team, quality, regulatory, etc. So then they did send us a list of questions, long list of questions still. So all the documents were in there so they could review. Then they sent us the list of questions. And we had to create a good momentum, a good pace, lots of focus on answering those questions as fast as can be, right? Because that's the moment where things go back in your hands and you can decide that you're going to give it, 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. Now, fortunately, we didn't had to redo, long tests, etc. So it was just like clarification, a few additional small tests, etc. So that went quite well. And then we started the clinical review. So once your technical file review is done, they start the clinical review. And we got some questions early September 2025. And that's why I said, okay, we're here for 6 months. And I excluded, mid-December to mid-January nothing happened. So it was March. But we got a first list of questions. We answered them very fast, within days. And then we got another 5 questions. So I say, this starts to sound like we're getting near something. And again, we answered within a few days. And then, yes, end of November, we got the beautiful pre-Christmas gift. I would say if you look at it, it's difficult, right? The roadmap for FDA, what you need to produce for FDA is very, very clear. But still, if you find the right regulatory resource, and we have very strong regulatory resource within Cardiawave, you can understand what the expectations are. So you can make your life easier by making sure that in the first place, your technical file is complete. The second thing we did was also, prior to starting the study, we did the clinical pathway review, CPR, with our notified body. And they contract an external group of experts that will review your study proposal and let you know if the design is okay or not. So they will not consult, they will not advise, they will tell you, okay, your study design makes sense for this population and the endpoints that you're willing to demonstrate. And if they tell you it doesn't make sense, it's on you to decide to change it or not, right? But in our case, there was an alignment between what the key opinion leaders who were working with Cardiawave to design the study and the clinical expert of the notified body had in mind. So it made life easier. So where we're also feeling good now is that we think that our technical file is very robust, as we're now in dialogue with the FDA. And we think that on that front, we should not have any issue. And the fact that we got CE mark is also, I think, allowing us to feel strong about the technology, the safety, feasibility, and efficacy. And our next step is our FDA IDE study. Again, we're in a dialogue with the FDA at the moment. It's too early to give any timelines, but I think the very first meeting in November was very constructive and productive. And what's really nice with FDA is that they don't advise you on anything, but they ask a lot of questions, so you kind of understand where they are, and it's a predictable process. The different stages are attached to a number of days, 90 days. When you submit for pre-sub, it's 70 days. When you submit your minutes of the meeting, it's 30 days. When you go back and submit your ID, it's 90 days. And even, as we hear with FDA at the moment, it's not easy. I think their life is not easy, given everything that we know. And then the shutdown, but I have not seen them deviating from their timelines. I think they're very good at keeping the timelines despite the staff shortages, the shutdown they had at the end of 2025. So I'm confident that we're going to have a good dialogue and a very positive experience there.
It sounds like you've had a lot of positive experiences with the business. Is there any sort of setbacks or moments of doubt that you or the team had to really focus on?
Well, there is always some surprises at least at the very beginning. Now we're past the moment where we're in the high level of turbulence when it comes to R&D, prototyping, early clinical experience, right? And this really makes us feel very good, positive, confident, because we've quite de-risked the technology, and the fact that we have CE mark is another kind of big milestone, de-risking element. Now the next steps are going to be with funding. So we're supported by a group of very loyal and engaged investors. But for the FDA study, we need to raise a C round of 55 million. And we see that investors, VC strategics, are engaging with us. The process and the timelines are, I think, longer than they were, at least in my previous experience when I was in a startup between 2010 and 2018. But still, it's on us and our existing shareholders to make sure that we have enough oxygen in the tank to be able to go to the next fundraising, to the next closing, which is the case. So when you raise money, you have to be very resilient. I think you have to you have to have your burn rate under control so that you make sure that you maximize your runway. You have, and that's not always the case, to be able to count on your existing shareholders to support you until you close. But that's something that, discussing with peers, CEOs of startups like Cardiawave, we all have the same experience at the moment. It's very low.
Very common at the moment. What do the next 3 years look like for you guys if everything goes well?
So the big focus is the FDA study. So 26 is going to be the year of dialogue with FDA, and we might start end of 26, early 27 enrolling in our IDE study. And that would bring us all the way between enrollment and follow-up to 2029. We're also in an early dialogue with CMS for reimbursement. So we have a very clear, we mandate an external agency in the US to draft for us the reimbursement pathway to understand what were our options. And we've made a decision on the pathway, which is very clear. We have milestones and things that we need to deliver in order to, at the time of market approval, also be able to have a coding and a coverage so that hospitals that are using Valvosoft post-clinical study, post-market, will also be able to ask for reimbursement in the US. So that's that. In Europe, in 2026, as we wait for the FDA approval, we will deploy the Valvosoft that we have, and with two objectives. Number one, demonstrate that when there is a Valvosoft in a site, patients are referred, so there is a population. Number two, demonstrate that when we move from clinical world to the real world, we maintain the excellent results in terms of safety, feasibility, efficacy. And the one thing that is quite interesting about Valvosoft procedure is that it's very easy to learn. You observe or you do yourself 2 or 3 cases, and you can fly solo. I don't know if I highlighted that again, and it's probably something I should have, but it's not done in a cath lab, right? It's done in an echo room. There is no need for anesthesia. It's a 70 minutes non-procedure, 2 hours in total, in and out from the hospital. And so, yes, the learning curve is very, very short. So we're going to deploy the machines in the centers that participated to the first in human and pivotal studies. Nevertheless, we're going to have our field engineers next to them at the beginning to make sure that they master the procedure. So that's 2026 in Europe. We're also going to collect data in a PMCF, as I was saying, post-market clinical follow-up registry. And we're going to initiate reimbursement dossier in Germany, in France. We have a lot of demands from patients. We have not been very active, except on social media, but social media, Cardiawave doesn't have the number of followers that some of the large corporations may have, right? So, but still, this was enough for patients from all around the world to contact us and willing to be treated. So we will need to take care of those patients, see how we can absorb them between the 4 centers where we will deploy Valvosoft in Europe in 2026. But that is very dear to our heart because we receive demands from families, patients that are in a lot of pain, have no other options, and we want to help them. So that's going to be also our focus in 2026. So to recap, in the US, FDA, our regulatory, clinical, and reimbursement execution, 26, 7, 8, and 9. In Europe, 26, we focus on deploying the machines we have, treat the patients that are on the waiting list, show that we can keep the good results, and we restart production. As of the moment we close this year on, the 55 million will also be part of it, will serve the purpose of buying parts and relaunching production so that we can start commercialization in Europe as of end of 27. We're also establishing a distributor network at the moment, but we're going to be very focused, right? Only the biggest countries in Europe will be part of our commercialization efforts.
Amazing. Well, it sounds like you've got quite the plan ahead. Obviously, we're coming up towards the end of the podcast. One thing I always like to do is to take advice to give to other people. And, you know, someone like yourself that's spent the best part of 20, 25 years in the space, what, I guess, hard-earned advice would you share to any founders or operators that are currently building a cardiovascular startup today?
Well, you know, as you said, right, in the CEOs that you're interviewing, there are many different backgrounds, finance, tech. And I think that any kind of background can be helpful, because at the end, being a CEO of a startup is it's mostly about attitude and personality. Number one, very high level of resilience, as I was saying, depending on where you are at which development stage, there will always be surprises, good and at times less good, and some setbacks. And resilience is very key. The energy of the CEO also needs to be quite high, because it's, as people say, a marathon at a sprint pace. So you go from one sprint to another. So it's very important to be able to manage your own energy and keep going, because it's a long process, right? From the moment you have an idea to the moment you, in general, exit through an acquisition by a larger corporation, which is the way it should be, right? Startups invent and the larger corporation will commercialize. So I think that, yes, managing your energy. And then number three, as soon as you can, surround yourself with top calibers. I think at Cardiawave, as I said, what helped us through the CE was the very strong regulatory competencies we have, but we also have very strong quality team, R&D, and operations. And I think that all of this is definitely important. And I know it's difficult to surround yourself with senior people, but you can attract top talents with equities and give them a participation to the success, right? So convince your board to allow you to have a good pool of stock options that you can use to attract the toppest talent you need. You can't just surround yourself with very junior people. For sure, we have a lot of them and they're extremely, extremely important in our teams. But the CEO needs to be surrounded by people that are expert in their own field. And, he or she just have to ask the right questions at times. But that's, I would say, the number three piece of advice. And then keep smiling, be positive, because your team look at you. And when you smile, you're positive, they feel good and they're really engaged. When they watch you kind of collapsing, you can, at times, but I think find an outside sounding board, partner, coach, whatever, so that with whom you can share all of that. But I think with the team, it's very important to remain the lighthouse in the storm and keep the positivity and the smile.
Well, that's it. The medtech market is traditionally not the fastest, is it? There's so many gaps, long gaps between milestones. So keeping it smiling, keeping it positive. Well, look, it was absolutely amazing having you on today, Carine. Thank you for sharing all your insights about the business, the market, where you guys are going next. It's been a pleasure having you. And if any investors are listening, to reach out to Carine. They are going to be raising. So thank you very much for your time today, Carine. And it's been a pleasure having you on the Crux of Cardio.
The same, Jordan. Really a pleasure. Thanks a lot for hosting us.
If there's one thing this space has taught me, both personally and professionally, it's that progress in cardiovascular care is never the result of one individual. It's built by ecosystems, by teams, by people willing to take the long bets on hard problems. At Crux, our mission is to support that ecosystem through talent, capital, and community. The podcast is one small part of that effort, a place to share the real stories from people shaping the future of cardiovascular care. If you found value in today's conversation, I would love for you to follow the show and share it with someone building in this space. And if you're a founder, operator, or investor working on something meaningful in the cardiovascular care space, we'd love to hear from you.